If you are a fan of brilliant colors, then this video could be helpful for you to experiment with bold and bright colors while painting with a very carefree attitude and freestyle manner. Hello and welcome to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. I'll be demonstrating today's painting on Canson cold press watercolor paper, 300 grams per square meter, and the size is A5. I'll be using the Da Vinci Cassano mop style brush size 4, and if you're still wondering what is the subject of painting today, it is going to be a vibrant looking jellyfish. So to kickstart, I have decided to use a nice bright pink, which is a mixture of magenta and opera rose. So I'm mixing these two colors and I'm going to paint this wet on dry technique. So I haven't pre-wet the paper, just using the wet paint to start roughly paint the jellyfish's head without any pre-sketch details. As I mentioned earlier, this is a very carefree and freestyle manner, so I don't want to complicate things by pre-sketching the jellyfish. So after applying the paint, I am going to use another brush which is a bit damp and smaller in size, also from Da Vinci Cassano series, and just drag the pigment that I have applied earlier by giving them some light washes and a little water spray onto those wet paint, followed by the larger brush that I used to paint in those pink paint mix. I'm just doodling using the tip of the bristle. So as you can see here, it seems this part that I'm painting is called its oral arms and not the tentacles. The tentacles are way much smaller, and it seems this is the part which gives you the sting. So the second color is going to be violet, and while the pink mix is still wet, I'm just painting in those violet mix onto those areas, also doodling in the form of doodles or curves. As you already know that jellyfish has got all these ruffles like shapes, so I'm just trying to create those shapes, and the same brush and violet paint, I'm just dropping in some dots onto the head of the jellyfish, or better known as the bell part of the jellyfish. Just to note that you are free to use any color of your choice. I just thought of starting off with pink and purple as they make a good color combination. However, do start with a brighter color. Just a little bit of water spray once again to suggest some movement on the wet paint as it adds more character to your painting. Since water is the main medium that bleeds the paint pigment, which is why it creates all those extra effects. So next I am using a clean damp brush to just run through those dots and make them bleed onto the white areas or unpainted areas. As you can see here, that soft movement or bleed of the paint onto the wet areas definitely creates a very interesting looking washes. And this helps you to paint very effortlessly. As I said, this adds to the carefree value. Next, I have just added a little bit of sapphire onto the violet paint to make it darker, and just dropping it in a form of dots onto the oral arms. Now when you paint this, some part of the painting may be semi-wet or some would be dry, but nothing to worry. As I said, this is a very carefree and freestyle manner. Next, I am going to use a fruit cocktail stick. You can use a toothpick to just scribble onto the wet paint, the entire jellyfish painting, to create those loose tentacles or hanging tentacles that are very thin. You can't notice much on the screen, but it still creates some texture, so try this, especially when the jellyfish painting is still wet. So moving on, I am going to paint the background with a bright blue mix. I'm using cobalt turquoise and some Persian blue. You can use any bright blue of your choice, doesn't matter. And I'm just using the same mop brush, just painting in loosely, using the wet on dry technique. So please take note, I haven't pre-wet the paper, so don't need any strategic painting method. Just paint the blue shade around the jellyfish painting. It doesn't matter if the jellyfish painting is still wet or dry. If it starts bleeding onto each other, I would say voila, it creates unique textures or mixtures. And I'm adding also some water spray to create more effects onto the painting. I am dropping in some indigo here and there just to add some contrast and make the blue shade much more interesting. At the end of the day, it looks like a jellyfish floating in a deep blue sea. So by adding in more shades would make the painting look more interesting and vibrant. Now once again, I am using the fruit cocktail stick or your toothpick to scribble onto the wet paint and create those hanging tentacles. And since the background painting is still wet, I am sure you could see it much more in detail. And I'm also dropping in some other vibrant colors, something more contrast. So it's a mix of some lemon yellow with green shades, and I'm also going to drop in some bright red just to add more vibrancy to the painting, and also acts as color blocking, just like how they do in oil painting and acrylic. Before I proceed further, just a quick mention on my recent tutorial of how to paint a mystical looking whale. So if you'd like to check it out, the video link is in the description section. Alright, since the painting is completely dry, time to fine tune some details. And using the earlier blue mix, which is the light blue mix, I am just painting onto the top part of the jellyfish bell or the head. Apply it lightly onto tip of the bell curve, and after that I am going to use a clean damp brush to give those pigments some light washes by dragging it downwards onto the lighter areas of the painting. So this stains lightly the entire head or bell part of the jellyfish, creating an impression of its transparent or translucent areas. So using the same technique and paint mix, I am applying onto the lower part of the jellyfish. So I've also extended the same paint mix onto the lower bottom towards the jellyfish's oral arms to create some shadow effects, since this is slightly darker blue shade. So I thought of creating some darker areas in between those oral arms. Time to paint more details onto the inner parts of the jellyfish's bell. So I'm using a darker red shade as it would look more contrasting against those bright pink and purple. So I'm using permanent carmine mixed with some cadmium red, or you can use orange to brighten up that carmine or crimson. So mix these two colors, and once again I'm painting it in uneven forms. As I mentioned earlier in this tutorial, they are more like doodles, curves or ruffle like shapes. So just repeat that same brush strokes using the tip of your mop style brush or round brush. And after that, as usual, I am using another clean damp brush to just drag those pigment, give it some light washes towards the inner part or middle part. And with the same paint mix, I am painting also the oral arms, similar to the earlier brush strokes that I made with the pink and purple. So just paint those ruffle like shapes using the tip of your brush. Once again, a little bit of water spray to create more texture and make some part of the paint pigment to bleed further. And as you do this, it suggests some movement in your painting, since this is a jellyfish in an ocean, or so those bleeding pigments would suggest movement like effect, and it adds a realistic effect onto your painting. And I'm using the tip of my brush to paint some fine lines of the tentacles. Earlier I used the fruit cocktail stick to create those tentacles. This time I'm using the paint itself to create those fine tentacles. And if you notice by now, this creates some contrasting color between the tentacles itself. So it varies from red to blue, which makes your subject pop up and look busy. More fine detail is needed onto the bell of the jellyfish. So I'm using a smaller size brush and using the same violet paint, I am just dropping in some dots. Basically it's just repainting onto the earlier painted areas, but in a smaller size and a darker violet shade, since the earlier one has been given some light washes. So this is going to be a very dry paint, so the dot appears much more sharper. So I am going to extend the same paint mix using the same small size brush to apply the dots onto the oral arms of the jellyfish. Next, as I foresee having highlights, I'm going to create those highlights using the white gouache paint. And before I apply the white gouache paint, I am going to pre-wet the entire painting, not by using a brush, but by using a water spray, because if you use a brush, then you might risk bleeding the entire painting. So the dark paints may bleed onto the ocean part, and you might have to restart all over. So just use some water spray and spritz onto the entire painting, mainly focusing onto the jellyfish painting. Just showing you a close-up of those wet areas where I used the water spray. And I've accidentally missed a few seconds of recording and when I applied the gouache, white gouache paint, but it's okay. Lucky thing I remembered to check. So over here you can see how the white gouache paint is bleeding onto those wet areas of the jellyfish painting. And I'm using a script brush to paint in these effects as well as its tentacles. At the same time, I'm also applying those highlights that I mentioned earlier onto its bell. Just a close-up of those white gouache effect, which resembles a very micro-sized nerve or veins, and you can only achieve this micro size by using a smaller size brush bristle. So script brush or rigger brush would do the trick. So once the painting is completely dry, I'm going to make one last final touches, which is highlights, but this time it is in a dry surface. So earlier the highlights were created onto the wet painting, but now I am applying onto the dry painting so that this would appear as popping highlights or very sharp highlights. And I've decided to apply it in a form of dots onto some part of its oral arms. So you don't have to apply fully the dots onto the entire arms, just a little bit of here and there. And I'm sure you'd certainly agree that the highlights definitely make a big difference onto this entire painting. And a little bit of scribbles or doodling as well. And script brush are really great in order to achieve these effects. And with this, the painting is complete. How do you like the vibrancy of this jellyfish? So if you are a big fan of vibrant colors, try experimenting using this technique and be bold to experiment with all these bright colors. Watercolors can be bright and bold as well. So if you enjoyed this tutorial, then do hit the like and share button as well as subscribe to my channel. See you in another tutorial. Bye.